Fallout 3 was the first title in the Fallout series released by Bethesda following its purchase of the series back in 2007, which makes Fallout 3's opening particularly interesting, given it was the first few minutes players were ever exposed to a Bethesda-developed Fallout title. And over the next few minutes, I want to examine that opening in more detail, taking a closer look at its design to try and pinpoint what it did well and what could have perhaps been done a little bit better. So let's not waste any more time and get cracking. There's not a whole lot to say about the opening cinematic, but I think the use of the track by the Inkspots, the brief glimpse of the Brotherhood of Steel, and Ron Perlman's narration do a good job of setting the scene for those new to the franchise, while also reassuring series veterans that Fallout 3 isn't a complete departure from the series they know and love. The game begins proper with a fade in from a bright white screen, something used consistently across the opening to denote a major transition, and which I'll highlight as and when they occur. And as the scene fades in, players will very quickly realise they're viewing the action through the eyes of their character immediately following birth. I like this concept. Bearing in mind how the rest of the introduction plays out, it makes sense to begin things here, and it's not an approach I've seen used in many other titles. Likewise, players being given the choice as to whether their character is a boy or a girl at this stage also makes a lot of sense given the scene's context, as does the option to choose a name. What makes a lot less sense is the third choice players are given, to choose what they'll look like as an adult.
Looks like they've finished the gene projection. Let's see what you'll look like when you're all grown up.
Fallout 3 gives the somewhat flimsy excuse you've just seen of it being gene projection, but I'm honestly not convinced giving players this choice at such an early stage is entirely necessary. For starters, it completely breaks up the flow of the first scene viewed through the eyes of the player character, one that's also rather important given it involves the death of their mother. Picking a sex and a name, sure, the game can just about get away with letting players choose each, as they normally won't take more than a few seconds to decide, but creating a character could prove to be far more disruptive to the unfolding narrative due to the time players could spend away from the scene tinkering with their appearance. There's also the issue of context. As you saw, the game manufactures its own context for why character creation takes place when it does. Player characters have just been born and their parents are able to get a sneak peek of what they will look like thanks to the marvel of the aforementioned gene projection. The problem is that this is wholly unnecessary. The opening already has the perfect context for the feature built into its story. Throughout the rest of the game, players are privy to key points in their character's childhood, witnessing events as a 1-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 16-year-old, and finally a 19-year-old. The story follows their development from birth through childhood and adolescence, and so much like choosing a sex at birth makes sense contextually, so too does choosing an adult appearance around the 16 or 19 years old mark. After all, that's when players' characters would really begin to mirror the appearance they've selected. Fallout 3 does allow players to switch to a third-person perspective from the age of 10 so they can see a younger version of their character, which is a nice touch and would obviously need to be removed if players didn't choose their appearance until later. But given the game locks to a first-person perspective during the toddler scenes, keeping it that way until a little further into the opening wouldn't break consistency and would also ultimately better align players choosing an appearance with the correct period of their character's life. After players choose their look and the scene ends in dramatic fashion, a fade to white signifies a transition in time to 1 year later, with players now a toddler. The next segment is fairly bread and butter game design, aimed squarely at ensuring players can safely become accustomed to two of the most important mechanics they'll be using during the game, movement and interaction. A gradual introduction of mechanics which continues throughout the entirety of Fallout 3's opening. Players get used to movement in the pen and have their first opportunity to interact with the world when they open the gate, which is required in order to further progress. As mentioned, it's nothing overly special, but it again makes sense given the context of the scene. Toddlers are at an age where their ability to move through their environment and interact with it increases in scope, and this is mirrored by the options offered to players. Next up is a look at the Your Special book, and again this is a fairly solid idea which ties well into the idea of growing up, and is nicely framed as a children's book. Fallout 3 then begins sowing the seeds of what the entire game will be about, which I don't mind. As the opening continues, players will begin receiving more hints that their father has a motive beyond just living in the vault, so the scene with him here perhaps gives an early indication of what that motivation may be for those paying attention. There's also mention of a martyr to better set the scene for the next period of players' lives, before the scene fades to white again. The next section of the introduction continues to open up new options, with players now 10 years old and enjoying their birthday party. The area itself isn't a whole lot bigger than the one players were just in as a toddler, but there are more options for what to do next presented to them. Having focused on basic movement and interaction during the toddler segment, this next part revolves around players' inventory, dialogue, and generally getting to better know some of their neighbours. I like the little hint players are given that their father may not have always been a vault dweller when old Lady Palmer almost spills the beans.
Are you having a nice party? 10 years old. My. Seems like only yesterday that your daddy came. Goodness, listen to me ramble. You're waiting for your present, aren't you?
And the present of a Pip-Boy, accompanied by a number of attendees giving gifts, is a nice way of pushing players towards investigating how the Pip-Boy itself and item management work. The only other scene of note during the party is the confrontation with Butch. As with the speech options with other characters available during this section, players can choose to be good, bad, or somewhere in between, but there's no karma reward or penalty attached to their choice. It may seem inconsequential, but I consider it a training exercise of sorts, a chance for players to see how their choices could affect events without there being any real consequence to their experimentation. It pushes them to think more about their choices ahead of a slightly more involved set of options being presented to them during the confrontation with Butch outside the GOAT exam, which, unlike this conversation, will affect their karma level. If the gate during the toddler stage acted as the most basic of skill checks to make sure players could move and interact with things before the story progressed, then the same is present here. Players can't leave the area until they've exhausted enough dialogue options and their father tells them to go find his colleague Jonas, again acting as a check to make sure players leave the area with an understanding of how dialogue functions. The gradual in-world expansion of mechanics continues in the basement, this time via the BB gun and a rad roach, which teaches players about aiming, shooting and VATS, before the scene fades to white again. As players begin this new section as a 16-year-old and are able to get a few more details about the past from their father, I want to quickly talk about the game's backstory. I'd imagine there are going to be two very distinct camps with two very distinct opinions regarding this particular issue. There will be some who enjoy being given a robust history for their character ahead of entering the open world, and there will be others who I'd guess prefer a less railroaded approach. Personally, I'm in the first group. As someone who cares less in general about the role-playing side of things and being able to create a character who's relatively unattached to events prior to the game, I see no issues with it. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that having quite substantial motivation immediately upon leaving the vault, namely finding my father, helped make the transition to the open world feel much smoother. But for those who prefer something more in the mould of New Vegas, for example, where there's little setup beyond you're a courier who was shot in the head, nursed back to health and is now free to do whatever they please, I think it would have been something of a disappointment. There's no right or wrong answer, but which side of things you fall on will definitely affect your opinion of Fallout 3's opening. Before heading off to complete the GOAT exam, there's the first of 20 bobbleheads to grab in a fairly obvious location which players will have to walk straight past in order to leave the room. There's also the first computers players can use to pick up a little additional backstory, which again gives them the opportunity to interact with something new. Outside the room where players take the GOAT, they'll also find a martyr being bullied. This expands on the dialogue mechanic by introducing percentage-based speech checks after players got used to the idea of their choices having consequence during the birthday party, and it's also used to introduce the karma system. And it's great that there are a number of different ways this scene can end. Wally can be convinced to leave, a fistfight can start, the aforementioned speech check can be used to end things quickly and peacefully, or if players have a particularly mean streak, they can even join the tunnel snakes in bullying a martyr. At the end of the confrontation, a karma reward or penalty may be given depending on the choice players made, which is a great way of introducing the system in a controlled environment, but apart from that, there's seemingly no real consequence beyond what happens during the scene itself. This is a common trend among many of the interactions which take place during the Vault section, and in my view, it's a missed opportunity. Using this scene as an example, players taking the more unkind route by also bullying a martyr makes no difference to the scene soon after when she wakes them up following the next transition. You'd think players would be the last person a martyr would come to for help after how badly they treated her previously, but their choice actually makes no difference whatsoever, which is a real shame. There are choices during the introduction to be made soon after which matter more, and some will feed back into events later in the game, but during the first few segments of the opening they seem to matter very little. The GOAT itself is a novel way of guiding players towards the tag skills that may potentially prove most useful to them, and I like the fact they're able to talk to Mr. Broch and choose them for themselves should they wish, but some of the answers definitely don't match the tag skill they're associated with. When asked what they would do to get old Mr. Abernathy out of his quarters after he's locked himself in, they can answer, walk away and let the old coot rot, which for some reason corresponds to the repair skill. Likewise, when asked how they'd play a prank on their father, players can choose to manipulate the power wattage on his razor so he'll get an electric shock next time he shaves, which corresponds to lockpicking for some bizarre reason. I may be unaware of the latest and greatest in shaving technology, but I don't recall having seen any with a built-in lock. After the penultimate fade to white, players are woken up by a martyr 3 years later with the news that Jonas is dead and their father has escaped, and thus begins the longest section of uninterrupted gameplay prior to players leaving the vault. And the quest, named Escape, is a rather good one, with some nice design touches here and there and a fair bit that can change depending on the choices players make. The first opportunity to shape how events play out is given to players almost immediately upon beginning the quest. More often than not, this conversation with the martyr will end with her giving players a pistol, but if they choose a certain set of responses, she'll decide not to. This doesn't change anything right away, but when players come across her being interrogated by her father and Officer Mac later, there will be a very different outcome. Instead of a martyr simply being questioned until her father, the Overseer, decides she can offer no further help, she'll actually use the pistol she didn't hand over to players to kill Officer Mac. It's a lovely touch I'd wager many will have missed. Beginning to explore the vault, Officer Kendall will spot players almost immediately and becomes hostile as soon as he's dealt with the nearby radroaches. Some might argue his becoming hostile was a missed opportunity for players to talk their way out of the situation, but there is precedent set earlier in the opening for why he might be immediately aggressive. When players leave their 10th birthday party, they can head up a flight of stairs before they head to the basement to meet Jonas, and if they do, they'll be able to eavesdrop on this conversation.
Enjoy the party, sir?
Bah! I only showed up because Amata's friends with the brat. Give them a few more minutes and then I want that place cleaned up and everybody back to work.
Sure thing, sir.
It seems the Overseer is not a huge fan of players, and Kendall is one to follow whatever orders he's given, and so with that being the case, and given the Overseer does probably want to kill players, I can understand why Kendall's immediately hostile. Not far away, Butch requests players help saving his mother from radroaches, and there are multiple ways to approach this too. Players can help him themselves, arm Butch so he can do it instead, refuse to help, or just simply kill him. And even here, there can be some variation which some might miss. Despite it looking like there's no way to advance without killing Officer Kendall, there's actually a decent bit of level design here in the form of the door to the toilets opposite the bedroom's exit. If players sneak through here while Kendall deals with the radroaches, they can avoid killing him entirely and go straight to helping or not helping Butch. If they choose to come to Butch's aid, Kendall will then actually visit him and his mother to ask if they've seen players, at which point Butch will lie and say he hasn't.
God damn it, Butch, I told you to get back to your room.
Oh, sorry, officer. I'll go right back inside.
Okay then. Hey, you haven't seen the Doc's kid, have you? We're still looking for him.
No, sir. Good luck with your search, though.
Whatever. Get back in your room.
Which also adds more context as to why Kendall was there in the first place. Rather than simply being there by chance, it wouldn't surprise me if he was sent there to kill players, given the fact he's so keen to find them. There's also a nice but rather sad bit of environmental storytelling in Butch's mother's room, in the form of the bottles of alcohol littering the floor by her bed, which prove that she probably is the alcoholic some suspect her of being. She even sits down and immediately opens another drink immediately after being saved. Another clever addition. After a brief chat with Officer Gomez, who is far more sympathetic to players' cause than Officer Kendall was, players reach the atrium. In terms of design, I really like the inclusion of Tom and Mary Holden here. First and foremost, they serve to highlight the brutality of the guards. There's little need for the guards to kill either of them, but they also act as an early warning for players. Up until this point, they've only faced radroaches and Officer Kendall's melee attacks, and so having both Tom and Mary be slaughtered as they run towards the unseen guards acts as a clear visual warning to players that they're about to face tougher, better equipped enemies. And of course, there's even the opportunity to avoid the pair being killed entirely by rushing the guards before Tom and Mary have the chance to do it themselves. When players finally reach the Overseer, there's even more choices to be made. After killing Officer Mac, they can kill the Overseer but ruin their friendship with a martyr, spare his life and get him to stand down, or even convince him to give them the key to his office so they can finish their escape. If they don't manage that, no problem. They can also find a key in the Overseer's room, which is signposted by a martyr moving there after her discussion with her father. And if players aren't keen on doing any of that, they can also sneak past the trio entirely and pick the lock to the Overseer's office, before either hacking the terminal to reveal the passage, or using the password hidden in the nearby locker. Players finally make it to the vault's exit, where they once again meet a martyr, who will refuse to join them and react with sadness at their leaving, or anger at their brutality for killing her father, before players are finally free to leave. Two final guards also show up here who can be dispatched relatively easily, but it's great that if players head for the exit without fighting them, the guards will decide it's not worth the trouble and quickly retreat. And it's here that we come to my other biggest issue with the opening, the fact players are given the option to redo their choice of sex, name, appearance and stats before heading out into the wasteland. I understand why it's included, and it's something which occurs in every game of this style, but if there's one title I feel strongly that it shouldn't have been included in, it's Fallout 3. As discussed earlier, New Vegas, and indeed Morrowind, Oblivion and Skyrim, all ensure the characters players take control of is a fairly blank slate with little backstory to speak of, but in Fallout 3 there's been something of a journey to get to this point, and it features a much more in-depth opening narrative than any of the examples I just mentioned. The selection of all the different facets that make up players' characters takes place during their formative years, and other than the appearance issue I spoke of towards the start of this video, they are generally woven very well into the fabric of the introduction. In other Bethesda games, and New Vegas, it's very much a case of choosing them quickly and then getting on with the rest of the opening. But in Fallout 3, they are an integral part of the game's setup, and so letting players go back on the choices they made, in my view, weakens the overall impact of the narrative up until this point. As mentioned, I understand why it's included, but that doesn't necessarily make it a good decision. Once that's out the way, there's one last fade to white before players get their first view of the wasteland proper. I know I've been constantly mentioning those fades to white, and they're nothing particularly exciting, but they do serve to signify a major transition each time they're used, and so using it again here adds real weight to the reveal, even if it also adds a little inconsistency in that there's been no skip forward in terms of time. And of course, the vault being such a narrow, claustrophobic environment compared to what's laid out in front of players at this point only serves to make the reveal even more impactful. So there we have it, that's Fallout 3's opening, and you know what? I rather like it. As discussed earlier, players who prefer a less rigid approach to their character's backstory in their role-playing games aren't going to be huge fans of it, but I think the way Fallout 3 combines its expansion of mechanics and character choices with the narrative which unfolds is really well done, and there's some smart design choices thrown in here and there which clearly demonstrate that whether you're a fan of the opening or not, Bethesda definitely put a lot of time and effort into trying to do something different. Sure, there are some missteps here and there which means the game's opening isn't as good as it could have been, and after a first playthrough it may seem a little overly long for players who want to jump right into Fallout 3's wasteland, but nevertheless, Fallout 3's opening is still one I think has a whole lot to offer. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch the video, and do consider liking and subscribing if you enjoyed it, and let me know your thoughts in the comments either way, as it all does a great deal to help the channel, and hopefully I'll see you all again soon.